Hi, everyone. My name's Jessica Ferguson, and I am Shisa's Communications Director and podcast host. At Shisa, we aim to provide you with the best practices, tools, and insights necessary to emotionally and legally navigate consent crimes such as SA, sexual harassment, cyberbullying, and domestic violence. Through our content, we aim to return the power back to the people just like you. Today's guest is Annie Seifullah, who is both a survivor and an attorney at CA Goldberg, the law firm she joined in spring 2019 after graduating from CUNY Law School, where she developed a passion for anti-violence advocacy. Her ability to deeply connect to her clients and fiercely advocate for them is an outcome of being a survivor of intimate partner violence herself and a former client of CA Goldberg. Now, Annie teaches civil procedure at CUNY Law School and is a co-chair of the NYC Cyber Abuse Task Force, an organization of advocates and lawyers working at the intersection of technology-facilitated abuse and gender-based violence. She is also a member of the New York's Women's Bar Association Animal Law Committee. Annie, thank you so much for joining us today. Our audience is so lucky to have you here to share your perspective and your experience.
No, I was just saying, I feel lucky to be here and honored. So thank you for the opportunity.
So just to dig right into it, if you feel comfortable, could you please talk a bit about your experience as a survivor and how that led to your specialization as an attorney?
Yeah, well, those two stories are linked in a way that is difficult to separate. So if you don't already know my story, you can look it up. It's very public. About 9 years ago, I was a high school public school principal in New York City. And I loved my job. I had been a teacher for many years and a school leader. And I was also sort of privately battling, trying to get out of a very abusive relationship. I did luckily get out of that relationship, but within a couple of weeks after I stopped financially supporting my abuser, who had been threatening to destroy my life if I ever dared to do such a thing. He downloaded intimate images of me onto a laptop and distributed them to my boss, to my superintendent, and also to the New York City tabloid media, along with stories that were just extremely salacious and defamatory, calling me, a predator and a danger to children, and using my intimate photos as somehow proof that I was, not fit to be an educator. Though I made the front page of the New York Post and was immediately removed from my job, which just really turned my life completely upside down. I was, didn't realize I was a public figure under the legal standard, which made it really difficult to get any content removed or stories taken down. And I was a single mom. My son was 2.5 years old, and I was suddenly just, my entire world was just turned upside down, and I was being portrayed in the media and in the world as someone who I just was not. And my privacy was completely violated by a person who intended to cause me that harm and to ruin my life. So then I just started a totally different battle. At the time, what was formerly known as revenge porn, now we call it, there's different names for it, non-consensual pornography, image-based abuse are common terms that we use now. At the time, there wasn't a law in New York City or New York State making what happened to me criminal. And so I started advocating loudly for changes in the law. And eventually I did sue the Department of Education. I sued them in federal court for gender discrimination, because what happened to me was a very particular type of crime and domestic violence and intimate partner violence that happens to women especially. And I decided to put myself through law school during that time too. So a lot was going on. I was getting the best legal education I possibly could as a plaintiff in a very public lawsuit in New York City. And after, almost 4-year battle, I was able to settle my lawsuit successfully against the Department of Ed. I graduated from law school. And my attorney, Carrie Goldberg, who is very well known as sort of the founding mother of revenge porn law, she offered me a job on her team after I passed the bar exam. And so really the whole thing came full circle, where I got to clear my name, get some money from the institution that harmed me. And now I get to, really do the same work for people who have been harmed in similar ways to me. So it's sometimes I pinch myself. It's pretty amazing to be able to sit here and do this work and to have come so full circle on this, on what happened to me.
Oh, absolutely. I find that, like, I have chills, but I find that when you go through the worst possible experience of your life in a way that is pretty much outside of your control, and the system's built, and a lot of the time the pieces are laid to make it so that you don't feel like you have a case, or maybe you legitimately don't because the laws don't even exist yet.
Yeah.
And when you're able to harness the power of that experience and not only use it to create a purpose for your life, but to help shield future potential survivors or victims of this kind of abuse, I think that that's just one of the most powerful things that can happen in this world. And it creates such a light from you and from every other survivor advocate that I've ever had the pleasure of meeting. So thank you for having the wherewithal to be able to do that.
Oh, you're so welcome. I agree with you. Carrie and I sometimes joke that advocacy is the best form of therapy. I also am a fan of therapy. So it's important for getting through your trauma and things, but being able to, talk to people every day who are going through the same thing, it really helps to kind of normalize it and validate. Not normalize as in we don't want to make the trauma normal, but just that when you get to talk to someone who's been through something similar, there is something that is just extremely uplifting and empowering about it in a way that you just really can't predict until you're in the middle of it. And it's really true.
Totally. Well, your story of alchemizing your most painful experiences and turning them into a source of power, not just for yourself, but for others, as we said, it's so inspiring, it's so powerful. But for folks at home who are not familiar with cyberstalking and cyberbullying or harassment, how would you define this type of abuse? And how broad is that scope?
Yeah, the scope is incredibly broad. Tech, like in addition to my job at CA Goldberg, I'm also the co-chair of the New York Cyber Abuse Task Force, which is a coalition of advocates. We're working to, educate and pass laws and improve outcomes for people who are victims of tech abuse or cyber abuse. And really, tech is so ubiquitous. It's in every part of our lives, right? And online platforms and social media. We are really living in an age where you don't have an option to be offline. And if you are offline, people find it suspicious, right? And so, so this idea that if you're being attacked online, you should just go offline, is not accurate. It's not actually good advice. And also it's, people's livelihoods, people's sense of community, our lives there is no offline really. And so when you take these sort of old methods of abuse, which really are about power and control, they've been around forever, and then it's weaponized with tech, the scope of what cyber stalking and cyber harassment and cyber bullying can look like truly has no end. But if you kind of focus everything down to what we know about abuse and bullying, right, it's about power and control. And when you sort of like look at it through that lens, then it does make it feel a little bit more manageable, and you can start to define it a little better. And then you can kind of start to see the gradations of it. My work is really focused on where tech abuse overlaps with intimate partner and gender-based violence. But there's types of really awful tech abuse that exist outside of that scope, right? I talk to small business owners whose lives and livelihood are being wrecked because some delusional or vengeful former customer or even competitor has just decided to use online platforms to destroy their business reputation, right? So that's like a form of tech abuse that's different than kind of like, that's awful and terrible, insidious, right? But it's different than usually the kind of cyber stalking that I'm dealing with is when one determined human with abusive tendencies is using tech to obsessively control, surveil, bully, threaten their target. And that's kind of like where it exists within. And like I said, tech's everywhere. So it can take so many different forms. We wouldn't even have time to name them all here.
Totally. And then within the scope of that category of abuse that you mainly deal with, the closer relational one, what types of behaviors specifically would you say fall into that category of abuse, especially on tech platforms?
Yeah. So oftentimes when we're talking to people about tech abuse, and especially when we're trying to educate law enforcement or judges or, people who can make a real difference in safety outcomes, but can't always wrap their head around what's happening. we sort of have like conceptual buckets. So there's harassment, cyber harassment, where it's just unreciprocated, unilateral malicious contact without end, and it can happen. And then there's stalking, cyber stalking, which is similar. It can be like the unwanted, relentless messaging, but oftentimes it adds a layer of, we've heard of doxing, or also spreading someone's intimate images, and then alongside their address and posting something on Craigslist, for example, and saying, here's my name, here's my nude photos, come to my house, I want to have sex with you. And an abuser will impersonate their subject in that way. And so then it can actually online stalking can turn into in-person stalking. So there's like the harassment and stalking angles. And then there's also spoofing, which is where there's all sorts of types of spoofing technology, if even like Google Voice, right? But there's ones that are far more insidious than that, where you can use a free app to create different phone numbers to impersonate specific phone numbers. So it looks like you're calling from the court or from work. And abusers can use this spoofing technology to continue their barrage, even if a victim or target has blocked them, for example. So there's like harassment, there's stalking, there's spoofing, which can really amplify that. And then really the part that is, I think causes the most damage is when the abuser is using intimate images or information to coerce and blackmail and threaten the target into doing or not doing the thing that the abuser wants the target to do. It's like very broad. It fits so many different things, but those are sort of how we conceptually break them down. And then usually you have to don't think of them as like silos that are apart, almost think of them as like circles that overlap, because they all can play in together. And because it's tech, a victim feels truly like they cannot escape, no matter how many times I block, no matter how many times I change my number, no matter what you do, if one determined cruel person will stop at nothing. And that's really common in the cases that I'm dealing with my clients.
One sidebar question based on spoofing that you just mentioned is obviously with the rise of AI and the ability to create like AI generated content and voice capture and all the Mission Impossible type things that we've seen from being realized. Is that obviously amplifying this issue, or is that within the scope of what you guys are working on as far as like protections as well? Or
yes,
next step, the next generation of it?
Yeah, law is always behind tech. And so that's a really important part of my work, is sort of to understand what the new frontier is. Like right now, we really are tackling deepfakes, which is, if you're not familiar with that term, it's when a person will manipulate a photo or a video to make it look as if it's one person. So a really common form of this is a pornographic video will be like taken from the internet, and then using AI or using machine learning technology, the video is morphed to look like a person. So you can take your ex-girlfriend's face, put it on a porn star video, and distribute it to make it look as though it's the person you're trying to portray in a fictional way. And deepfakes are becoming more common. I'd say that's a form of AI that we're immediately tackling right now. But to your other point, which is that, this type of like one person who is determined to ruin another person's life, as quickly as they can create new usernames and passwords, they can continue to abuse. But imagine now that we have this technology that's being built where they can do that at scale, where that person can then give a command to like an AI type technology and do that multitudes of 20 and 25 and 100, as many as you can imagine. And that's what we're really concerned about right now, the types of abuse and exploitation and blackmail that's happening right now, that's led sort of by like a human doing a thing multiple times, can actually be done at a much larger scale with AI that is so frightening to think about, and so frightening to think about being the subject in the middle of that, not being able to escape it ever.
Yeah. And I think I'm going to jump forward just really quickly for that purpose, which is that when it comes to, obviously, as a platform, Shisa is really dedicated towards empowering and educating, especially existing survivors, but just, general professionals in the workplace with the understanding of what kind of evidence can be captured, or what kind of materials can be harnessed to, make a case and or prove that, let's say something like a deep fake occurs and there is now legislation being driven. How can somebody protect themselves should they find a deep fake video on the internet?
So it's such a good question, and there's lots of layers to it. But I think first and foremost, it's really important to find an advocacy organization or an attorney who understands tech abuse, because a big part of my job in being a tech abuse specialist is I am educating the police, I am educating the detectives, I am educating the judges as I'm advocating for my client, because they don't know. They oftentimes don't know and actually give false information. When people come with evidence, they'll say, oh, I can't take a screenshot as evidence. We've got to subpoena Facebook and get the original. Well, that's not actually true. So I actually know the legal arguments to make to be able to submit a screenshot as evidence because it's a photograph of a crime scene, right? And so like having a tech abuse a specialist, is really, really important, because they can actually help you, guide you through. But the most important thing, and it can be really traumatizing, I don't want to understate that, for so many of my clients, the act of preserving the evidence of their abuse is so traumatizing and re-traumatizing. So if you're able to do it yourself, it's best to be the master of your own case and your evidence file. Document everything, screenshot everything, make PDF documents and save them someplace safe. If you are concerned that your devices are compromised, like if your abuser has access, for example, to your iCloud username and password, they could also have access to, which is really common in in coercive relationships. It's very, very common for abusers to demand that their partner give them access to everything as a sign of loyalty and to show they're not cheating. It's all under, it's given an innocent reason, but it's all about power and control. And so the most important thing is to do some safety planning and secure your devices, to change all your usernames and passwords, and use two-factor authentication so that you know that your accounts are safe. And you may not realize it, but you might be sharing information with your abusive ex through like your Uber account, through your Seamless account, through your Netflix account, and so lots of times people think that there's like stalkerware on their phone. More times than not, their abuser has access to their Gmail or their iCloud, because you're just able to get such a tremendous amount of information through those utilities, right? So secure your personal safety and then document everything. And if it's too stressful for you to document, find a loved one or a trusted person who can help you with it, because you just have to keep everything. And as we know, a post can go up and get deleted, and then you won't have it unless you're able to subpoena the platform, which is really hard to do. So just all the contemporaneous, meaning in the moment that it's happening, screenshot it, have it timestamped, put it someplace safe, is the most important thing to start with. And then when you have a tech savvy advocate, they can help you understand how you're going to present that evidence to a judge or to a detective to help them understand what's happening to you and make sense of it.
I mean, that's such good insight to give, because I think that's something we often won't think about, right? We won't think that, assuming that you might have, a perpetrator who is a live-in partner or somebody that actually does have very immediate access or knows you well enough to guess whatever it might be, has any type of tools or resources to extract those passwords. It's something really important, I think, for our listeners to know about. And before we jump back, I have one added question to that, which is, we know that this kind of abuse does happen in the workplace too. And so assuming that you're on a company-owned machine, how do you, would it just be making sure that you are forwarding everything to personal devices, or how would you advise people protect themselves with company-owned machines?
As an attorney, I have to be careful, because there might actually be rules and regulations specific to your employer that have to do with how to keep like everything that happens at work might be proprietary information, and there might be a rule that says you can't forward it. So if it's happening in your workplace, I would say consult your employee handbook, like talk to a trusted person, and talk to an independent legal advocate outside of HR. Sometimes HR can be really helpful, but HR are the company cops too. So they're not looking out for you necessarily. They might be looking to protect the company. So it's really important to get independent advice from someone who can help you look at the facts, the specific facts, so that you can make sure you are preserving evidence or putting your company on notice in the right way that they need to be preserving evidence, because there might be unlawful conduct happening. Sorry, I can't give more specific. It's just like, I really want to make sure people know to protect themselves and to make sure they're talking to someone, if at all possible, talk to a legal advocate who you can get independent advice from, in addition to potentially a trusted contact within your company if there is one.
Absolutely. And I think it's important for people to know, like, a lot of those realities, a lot of those logistics within your corporate reality are laid out in print, and they might differ from the person that's giving you advice or from, taking just the word of HR alone. So it's a good call to action for listeners to take some time aside and make sure they're reviewing those materials. Just scooting back a little bit, when we're talking about, harassment and abuse and bullying, cyberbullying, et cetera, in the work, or that we know it happens professionally and personally, how do you find that those behaviors differ in those two spheres?
How does it happen differently at work versus like intimate partner violence, you mean? It's really interesting because the more that I work in this arena, and I work in with cases where we have a really abusive, sexually harassing boss, for example, and I have a lot of clients who have abusive, harassing either current or former intimate partners, there is so much overlap. I mean, the psychology of the abusive boss and the abusive partner is oftentimes like a Venn diagram that is a circle, right? And so it's like how they can exert control, how they can make people feel small, how they can use gaslighting techniques to make you second guess yourself. So you blame yourself for the behaviors, thinking that like, I've done something to bring this upon myself, and now I have to work harder to prove that I'm not the person that this person is saying that I am, right? And so actually those kind of behaviors, they show up everywhere, and they can show up in a boss, they can show up in an intimate partner, they can show up in a parent, a neighbor, a roommate. Like they really do overlap. It gets complicated. They're complicated in different ways, right? Leaving an intimate partner relationship can be extremely difficult because your lives may be linked in a way through children, through housing, through finances. You may have shared, if most people have shared, an immense amount of intimate information with a person in the context of a trusting relationship, and having that leveraged against you, right? It's so complicated. And violence is oftentimes reciprocal. Like sometimes a person who's in an abusive relationship becomes abusive themselves, starts to exhibit behaviors of their abuser too. And so it can be so complicated and difficult. And then in the workplace, you can have some of those complications, but really it's your livelihood, right? It's your livelihood, it's your professional reputation. For me, when I was 36 years old, having my entire professional reputation just upended, erased essentially, 15 years of what I had been working for. And I had to start over from like as if I was like, from day one with a brand new profession and trying to come back from this thing. And that's what happens to victims of sexual harassment. So I think that the most important there's not difference. The most important thing is to talk to people who you trust. I think that oftentimes survivors believe that there has to be an audio recording or a video recording or like photographic evidence. And sometimes the legal systems trick us into thinking those things are necessary too. But in my work, some of the best types of evidence are the testimony of a credible outcry witness. Someone you told in the moment when it was happening, someone you told before you went to work that day and after you went to work that day what happened, and documented it at the same time. Those kind of things can be really powerful evidence to have if you find that it's difficult, right, to like get the evidence the concrete evidence you think you need. Or the direct evidence, right? But your testimony and the testimony of a credible outcry witness are evident. That's evidence. That's evidence we use to create a case. If you need legal protections.
And do you find that verbal evidence, that testimony-based evidence, is effective when dealing with powerful perpetrators? When you have maybe, especially if this goes to some type of court and there's a jury. Mm-hmm. Find that, because I think it's a really common belief amongst those that are undergoing abuse and those that have survived it, that the person that they dealt with is powerful and has more resources and is compelling and is capable and oftentimes very trusted, like purposely builds a network of trust around them so that they have alibis for any of their behaviors. You find if someone has just that verbal testimony that they should feel comfortable moving forward with that alone because people are becoming maybe more aware of this. What does that take away for you?
Yeah, I mean, everything you said is exactly right. And I want to validate and hold that up because, fighting back against a powerful person who has more power, who has a bigger network, who has more financial resources than you takes so much courage. And a lot of people after they've gone through it say it wasn't worth it. Some people say it is, so I don't want to make it seem like it's like a, like there's some golden formula and you've got to do it, But I think your point is really important, which is that all of these things that the abusive boss, for example, uses to make you feel small, like I'm more powerful than you, I have a bigger network, people trust me, my reputation is golden. Those are all abuse tactics to silence and bully and intimidate a victim out of speaking. So it's unlikely it's the first time the boss has done that. You're unlikely the first person who's been on the other side of that behavior. And so oftentimes when we move forward on these types of cases, and it starts to get some publicity or a lawsuit goes public, people reach out to us and say, like, that happened to me too. It doesn't always happen, but it happens more times than not. That's one thing. You don't know what kind of resources and information is going to come to your, is going to be gathered once you enter into that process. Fundamentally, and to your question, the best evidence of anything at any time in a jury trial in court is just the authentic, credible testimony of a person who's gone through a thing, who has everything to lose and who is in legitimate fear and who did a courageous thing by holding a bully accountable. And I do think that, I don't just think, the data and is all around us that the tides are turning when it comes to juries having an understanding of what power dynamics look like in the workplace. And I think in Manhattan, when we got the, criminal prosecution of Harvey Weinstein, that was where I think that was like a really important turning point for us, where we got to see that, like, even the jury understood that even after being sexually assaulted by Harvey Weinstein, the victim had a reason to stay in touch and be friendly with him because of how powerful he was. Right. And so this kind of like victim behavior that is oftentimes turned upside down to make a victim look suspicious or not credible. The public who are our juries, the juries of our peers, are starting to understand that this is common and that these kind of powerful people are bullies who are, and that victims don't always act the way you think that they will in a really straightforward way. Now we actually have all sorts of stories and expert testimony who can explain why a victim would continue to stay friendly with the boss who's harassing or has sexually assaulted them, right? Or we're using the word essay. Sorry, I apologize. So I just think that there's layers to it, but fundamentally, yes, I think the tides have turned. I think that the public understands the nuances of the victim perpetrator relationship and how it plays out when someone has so much more power than another person.
Absolutely. And I think that we know that anything done repeatedly, usually you become better at it. And so I think that the more people can recognize, one of the things I've always found from talking to survivors is you can't fathom it until you're in it. You have your opinions, you have your biases, you have your assumptions about how you would or wouldn't behave, how you would or wouldn't react, how you would or wouldn't fight back. And I think until you've been in it, you can't really ever understand it. And I think the goal, especially with platforms like yours and platforms like this podcast, I think the goal is to make sure people can get to that point of understanding it without having to live through it.
Yes.
Amplifying these nuances. And I think it's important for people to know you're going to be told you don't have a case by the person who is trying to keep the case from ever happening. And,
that's right.
And so thank you for all of those insights. One of the things that we, aim to do here at Shisa is to dispel the myth that consent crimes are largely only occurring when perpetrated by a man on a woman, in order to get our communities to see this as a problem that actually impacts us all, Can you give any examples of instances of cyberstalking and cyber harassment that differ from the perpetrator gender pattern?
And by the perpetrator gender pattern, you mean the pattern I spoke about where it's like one determined man after a woman who's being victimized? Yeah, I mean, again, like I said, most of my cases do fit into sort of that model. However, probably one of our most notable cases, there was a cover story on a media outlet about it just this week. We represented a man named Matthew Herrick, whose ex-boyfriend was, and so this is, this happens in all sorts of different contexts of relationships and gender identity and sexual orientation. But his boyfriend perpetrated probably one of the worst cyber stalking campaigns we've ever seen. We had a very famous lawsuit against Grindr because the boyfriend was weaponizing Grindr by impersonating over and over, literally hundreds of impersonating accounts, impersonating Matthew, giving his pictures, nude photos, his actual address, saying, come to my house, come to my work, I want to have sex with you. And, really, I won't get into the details of it because it was very dark and very violent, describing violent fantasies he wanted people to come to the house and enact on him. And over the course of 2 years, Matthew had more than 1,000 strangers come to his house because of this cyber stalking campaign that his ex-boyfriend had used a dating platform to launch against him. So that's just one example, but we also have, actually, I was going to say that the Supreme Court case that just came down, Counterman, was a man obsessed with a woman, but it wasn't a romantic relationship. It was an obsessed fan. And so some of the celebrity and quasi-celebrity, meaning influencers, have really severe cyber stalking cases that don't necessarily fit into the obsessed man, former partner, ex-partner cyber stalking the woman. They fit into all variety, of genders, and those are really, really scary. And oftentimes, in New York right now, if you don't have a domestic relationship or an intimate partner relationship with the person who is stalking you, you cannot get a civil restraining order. Your only option is a criminal restraining order, which you have to get through the police and a criminal prosecution. There's a huge gap in New York law right now that we're working really hard to lobby and change so that any person who's stalking you, regardless of what their relationship is to you, you can go to a civil court and get a civil restraining order against them. So there's a lot of limitations in the law, but many examples that fit outside of that gender, that gender dynamic.
And speaking of gaps in protections and legislations, beyond the civil restraining order option, what are some other really glaring gaps that you see from that legislative perspective? The
real alarm bell that's ringing right now is based on changes now that are going to have to be made in state laws because of the recent Supreme Court decision in Counterman, which I referenced earlier. If you're not familiar with the case, it happened in Colorado. It was a man who was obsessed with a woman who was a musical performer. He cyber stalked her relentlessly. It's really scary. I mean, hundreds, thousands of messages, some of them really threatening. She didn't know who he was or what he looked like and was in constant fear of him showing up. He would send her messages that made it, that indicated that he knew what her car looked like and what she had been wearing that day. And she over a period of time was able to get a criminal prosecution, and he was sent to prison for a few years. He appealed on a First Amendment argument, saying that none of what he said was a true threat and that it shouldn't have been perceived as a true threat because he didn't intend it that way. And so this is this gap in the law right now. So the Supreme Court basically said that the standard in Colorado, which said basically that really had to do with if the victim feels enough fear that their life is completely upended, then that's enough to prove that it's stalking. But the new standard that the Supreme Court sent forward really requires there to be some intent on the perpetrator's part. So you can imagine this is going to create a loophole that a lot of survivors of stalking are afraid of, where if their stalker says, I didn't intend to cause harm, or I didn't know it was causing harm. So for people who are so obsessive that they're into delusional territory, for people who suffer from mental illness, or not to stigmatize, but certain types of mental illness and personality disorders do have distorted reality where you can't always tell what the impact of your behavior is, that those will make those kind of gaps in the law right now are going to make it so that it's going to be hard for some survivors of stalking and current victims of stalking to get legal protection, because it'll be based on the intent of the perpetrator rather more than the impact on the person who's being stalked.
Which is so wild because we see, I mean, en masse, we see cyberbullying that just has death threats and asks people to kill themselves and is just so vile and poisonous, especially once it's amplified for whatever reason. The consequences of that, even if something's never really acted upon by that person experiencing it, I mean, that is trauma, and that is really hard to prove. So
Yes. There was a recent study, I can give you the link if you want to drop it in the show notes, but there was a study, I think it was in 2018, that was basically compared the behavioral outcomes of victims of stalking versus cyber stalking. It seems counterintuitive, but for people who are being stalked in real life by a person, online is real life, I shouldn't say that, by people who are being physically stalked by a person who they know that physical stalker is, and people who are being stalked through digital platforms who may or may not know who that person is, that the study showed that the people who are being cyber stalked actually have amplified emotional and mental harms and more self-protective behaviors. And the study kind of concluded that it's because of the ubiquitousness. It's kind of like, it's like not knowing exactly who it is, not knowing exactly when that message is going to come through, not knowing exactly if this is going to cause you harm or not. It's like the not knowing part of it. Actually, it's very counterintuitive, but it actually, in a way, it amplifies the trauma and harm and the tendency of the target to have like hypervigilance. And so I think that's like, I share that study with everyone all the time, because when I have a judge say like, what's the big deal? It's just online. Then we can share that kind of information and educate people about it. There is no offline. And in some way, it's worse. It's hard to kind of like wrap your head around unless you're really informed, on the issues.
Absolutely. And I think that, there's been studies, right, that show, is it cortisol, the stress hormone, that when your body or your mind is preparing for fight or flight and you're dread, when you're anticipating something happening, that can be so much more deeply draining and hard to correct in the long term than just that quick flash of fight or flight in the moment, hand to hand with somebody. Not to say that either one, as we said, is any more traumatizing, but they both have these long-term scar tissue impacts. And the thing that I think people forget about online bullying or harassment is that it amplifies the barrier to entry for an abuser, because you could say whatever. You could be somebody that would never speak up in a real, interaction, but you can feel compelled to be bold and say horrible things to people just through technology.
That's right.
The way that it can embolden more people to create trauma on others is definitely a focal point. But to keep kind of moving forward a little bit, you mentioned, revenge porn, and that was, a huge part of your own journey. And those of us that I fit into the bucket of, late millennials, cusp Gen Xers, whoever the people, those of us that lived through MySpace and through LiveJournal and through these early versions of, photo sharing or social media apps. Back then, obviously, the revenge porn sites like isanyoneup.com makes this topic particularly relevant for us. And when we were in high school, it was not uncommon to see nudes sent wide, and to have that kind of a microcosm, not as public as it is now with our social media being so ubiquitous and what you experience, but we would still see how that could have really crazy impacts on the of someone's experience in life. But specific to revenge porn, what do you think are some of the gaps that you've seen in terms of protection? You've mentioned some from your own experience, and what have you seen recently?
Well, luckily, thankfully, the laws, when I was going through my own justice journey and healing journey and trying to get my life back, I was able to work with, local advocacy organizations, and we got the law passed in New York City first, and then New York State to criminalize what we called revenge porn, and now we call non-consensual pornography or other things. Or NCP for short. So I can say, when I say NCP, you'll know what I'm talking about. So there's a lot of gaps. So first of all, like so many of our laws, our stalking and harassment and NCP laws, they're mostly based in states. So there are some like federal laws, but in order to get those enforced, you really have to go to the FBI. And the FBI really, in our experience, is dealing with like high level child exploitation, trafficking, bomb threats. But when it comes to sort of like the daily intimate partner violence kind of crimes, really you're talking about going to your local police and you're dealing with state laws. And so one of the biggest gaps to justice right now is just the patchwork of laws that exist in all the different states. And depending on where you are or where your offender is, you may not have the best law available to you to enact justice. So a couple of things specific to NCP. One is that New York is unique in that we have two different types of remedies where if for example, my ex-partner distributes my nude photos without my consent, I can either go to the police and file a police report and have him investigated and arrested and have like a criminal record, or I have a private cause of action, meaning I can sue for damages. And injunctive relief, so that there's a restraining order, and so a lot of states don't have that second option, which is the civil the civil option. And if you are a person who's interested in advocating for NCP and you want to look at your state and see that there's a gap there, advocate for that, because being able to be a plaintiff who hires an attorney or local legal services if you can't afford your own attorney, and being able to like hold your offender accountable for money damages, even if it's a small amount, money makes a difference in the lives of a victim. In fact, in a lot of ways, more than having your offender have a misdemeanor criminal record, right? So that's one gap. I think more states need civil remedies. And then there's some states, New York is among them, where it's that intent element. In order to hold someone liable for NCP, you have to show that they not only distributed your nudes without your consent, but also that they did so to cause harm, and that they meant to cause you harm when they did it, or they meant to harass you or whatever. There's different kinds of intent. So that means if they intended to have a laugh, or if they intended to entertain their friends, or make a little money off of it, then they could actually use that as a valid defense to being held accountable. So the intent element on the best NCP law, like I think the model statute we look to is Illinois, which treats it more like a privacy violation. So rather than having to prove intent, it's just the fact that your privacy was violated. That is the damage has been done. And so we try to, as much as possible, encourage states to pass laws that are more focused on the violation of privacy, less like harassment where we have to show some intent to harm.
Well, and it's wild that it almost feels like it would be a body assault issue versus even just a privacy one. And to find out that there are situations in which when people make money off of it, and that's their intention, off of your image released without your consent, it's wild to hear that would not be deemed as intent to cause harm.
Well, there are laws that you could use, like a copyright law potentially, or there's other types of laws you might be able to use if someone was commercializing off of your images without your consent. But again, it's like another type of law, different state by state. It might be federal rather than a state law. It just becomes very complicated for victims to get justice when the patchwork of laws that exist. If you go way back in time, these laws fundamentally were created to protect the physical property of wealthy white men. And so we have done our best to try and evolve the law over time to include more people in what justice looks like. But it was never meant we were never meant to be protected from this type of harm in the law. In fact, if anything, it was the opposite, right? And so there's a lot of limitations to the parameters of justice.
Absolutely. And obviously it is too, when these laws were written, female spouses and human beings were property.
Exactly. Yeah. It's still embedded. It's in the DNA of our legal framework. And so we're always trying to sort of excavate old bad language into new. And it's a process.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of the patchwork of laws, and I think it was Illinois you mentioned that has this kind of gold standard, correct, of one of the protective laws for privacy. What are some other laws that people that are listening should be aware of? That I know it's state by state, so you can't be exhaustive perhaps, but what are some top laws, maybe even just for New York, that are really worth knowing about as far as what is in place to protect you?
Yeah, there is one. So there is one really great new federal law that I'll talk about first, because this applies to everyone if you're in the United States. As part of the VAWA Reauthorization Act, there was a new statute that was created that gives you a civil cause of action, right? That civil one I was talking about where you can get money or a restraining order. There's a federal civil cause of action for revenge porn or non-consensual pornography now. So that no matter where your perpetrator is and no matter where you are in the country, if someone distributes your nude photos without your consent, then you can sue them. And there's essentially like a liquidated damages, punitive damages of $150,000 minimum. And so again, there's limits there. Obviously, if your offender is broke, it's not worth your money and time to sue them. However, it might be worth it to call an attorney and see if you have a case. Because it's a minimum. Literally, it's like if it happens and you proved it happened, it's a minimum $150,000 essentially fine for having distributed someone's nudes without your consent. And I love civil causes of action because then you're the plaintiff, you're in the steering wheel, you drive the car. Whereas a criminal prosecution, the state is in charge. It's like the state versus your abuser, and so it's really outside of the victim's control where it goes and what happens. So that federal law is great. You should definitely look into it if you're interested. And then there's other states. California is one. I think New York just enacted this as well. A lot of states are catching up in their anti-violence codes. Oftentimes it's in the context of family court or domestic violence proceedings, where coercive control is becoming a crime in and of itself, which is incredible. Because then we can show if an abuser has a pattern of threatening, intimidation, bullying, even if there's not, even if there's not like one severe, terrible act, we can actually show a pattern of behavior where a person was under so much control in a relationship that it amounted to a pattern of criminal behavior, criminal abuse. And so that's one other area that I'm really excited about, is seeing how the coercive control is now starting to be seen as an abuse in and of itself. And it's hard to prove because it can include menacing and intimidation and coercion and harassment and stalking. It can, and so rather than having to prosecute 8 different things under all these and prove all these different elements, coercive control can be shown as a pattern in and of itself. And I'm a real big fan of that. And I hope we can get that passed in more states, because I think it's really, that can really make a difference. And also, like, in changing the way people think about it too, we still have this very old framework of abuse where it's like, if there's not a bruise, if there isn't a hospital record, if there isn't a domestic violence report from the police, then it probably didn't happen. And now starting to see these really these forms of like emotional and mental tactics are starting to be recognized more. And I think that's incredible.
Absolutely. Wow. So thank you again for all of this work that you're doing and for illuminating so much of this for us. As one quick parting gift before we start to wrap for our audience, are there any free resources, folks, or social media accounts or anything like that you would recommend other than your guidebook, the Scarlet hashtag? Is there any specific resources you'd suggest people go and tune into or follow to remain apprised of their options?
Yes, absolutely. There's so many. You should also follow my law firm on Instagram at CA Goldberg Law. We're very active on social media and LinkedIn too, and pushing resources for different things that are coming up. So definitely follow my law firm on socials. And then the New York Cyber Abuse Task Force, the website is cyberabuse.nyc. I'll give it to you so we can drop it in the show notes. It's a lot of the resources we have are specific to New York, but a lot of them aren't. And we actually have a manual that it's a free PDF. You can download it. It's about 200 pages, chock full of resources for victims of cyber abuse and their practitioners. So if you live in a state where you cannot find a tech abuse attorney, but you have like a really smart family attorney or someone you can actually give them this manual, and it will actually teach them how to be a tech abuse attorney. And that's an incredible free resource. And the appendix of that has national resources, websites, almost anything you can imagine. Consumer Reports, which is an incredible nonprofit organization. I didn't know that they were a nonprofit until recently. They just published, it's online. If you go to, it's like a tech safety planner, and it's actually responsive. So if you think that your abuser is accessing your accounts, you can go through and it's responsive. You can answer yes, no questions, and it will take you through basically like a directive on how to secure your devices. So top level, those are the ones I think you should go to first. But if you go to the cyber abuse manual, you'll see there's pages and pages of resources that are free. It's a free PDF to download. And also check out my platform, Scarlet Hashtag, for anyone who's been a victim of public shaming. Definitely, this really common in abuse, intimate images being distributed, defamatory campaigns, cyber harassment. It's very public and embarrassing. I have a lot of resources for people to survive public shaming events as well.
I love it. Well, on behalf of all of us at Shisa and survivors, thank you so much for joining us today, Annie, and for the work you're continuing to do. And then for the listeners, check out Annie's firm, as she said on IG, at CA Goldberg Law, and give her guidebook a download at the link below. At Shisa, we currently offer a statutes of limitations map to show you how long you have to report incidences of sexual harassment by state, and an AI chatbot that is trained to answer your most pressing questions about navigating sexual harassment and assault. We've also added a rape kit collection site library by state to our AI chatbot for those who may need it. You can check that out also in the link below. And for today, thank you so much for tuning in, and we will all see you next time on Shisa Speaks Podcast.